Well, hello again. Here's a good question, one that attracted the interest of Boris Johnson and the Cambridge classicist Mary Beard about five years ago in a big debate. And that is, were the Greeks superior to the Romans? Well, golly, there are a lot of very knowledgeable people who have studied the subject for a long time. I wouldn't presume to uh, add anything noteworthy or startling to the debate, but I think I can sum up some of the main points and give you my view on that too, for whatever that's worth. There is no question that the accomplishments of both of these civilizations were astounding even now, but certainly for their time. They achieved accomplishment in different areas. Their prowess was somewhat different, but each extraordinary in its own right. So let's try and examine the positions for each. Since the question is whether the Greeks were superior to the Romans or not, I'll start with the Greeks, and they're the yes people. Well, I guess in no particular order, the first thing that comes to mind is their extraordinary accomplishment in science. They were pioneers in cartography, the making of maps. They were pioneers as well in astronomy. It was Aristotle who conceived the notion that the Earth actually rotates around the sun. Took quite a long time for everybody else to catch up with him. It took really Copernicus and Galileo to do that, despite the best efforts of the church to tell them that they were wrong. But Aristotle was there, and he was making his brilliant observations. They were pioneers in mathematics. We all know about geometry and plane geometry, solid geometry, and we even call it Euclidean geometry because, of course, Euclid was the Greek of that era who pioneered much of that. They used data, they used experiments, and they didn't just do what they were told, they decided to test for themselves. One of their numbers, who spent his life in Sicily but was nonetheless a Greek, was Archimedes. I recently read a book about the greatest scientists in the history of the world, and the author made the case that Archimedes may have been the greatest of all, certainly the equal of Newton and one or two others of his ilk. So in science, they were really unparalleled, certainly in their era, and unparalleled perhaps in all of history. They contributed amazingly in philosophy. They had three really stunningly important philosophers in Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. And of course, what these philosophers did was to advance the notion that to understand life, we have to use reason, we have to use deduction. They were kind of walking away from religion as it existed in Greece, from the what we now call the mythological creatures that guided many Greeks and in literature. They decided that they were going to be pragmatists. Sounds a bit like the Enlightenment. They were precursors of the Enlightenment. It took a long time for the rest of us to catch up with that one. But nonetheless, a very impressive stance to take at that early age. Remember that the high period of Greece, and particularly Attic Greece, the Greece of Athens, was between about 500 BC and 350 BC, something like that. So it was a fairly short period of time. So they didn't have much time to get done what they decided to get done, but they were certainly very successful. In the arts, they were astounding. Their sculptures, the statues that we have from ancient Greece are, again, almost unparalleled in their beauty and in the magnificence of their execution, their artistry, the people they depicted. And while we're talking about art from hard substances, what about their architecture? The Parthenon, the Acropolis, the buildings they built when they decided to put something into it were really just amazing. In political science, we know, of course, that they invented the notion of democracy, of what we would now call direct democracy, where all of the citizens of Athens gathered together en masse to make laws. The laws were put forward by a group of people that were drawn by lot each year to decide where legislation was needed, and then the vote was passed or not by a sheer majority of the citizens attending. We now, of course, have representative democracies where we appoint somebody to vote on our behalf and hope that they represent us faithfully. But nothing like this had existed before. And we do owe much of the political science that has developed since then to them. In sports, of course, from them we have the Olympic Games. They did not contest as many sports as we do, but the Olympic Games were a major event every 4 years, even then, in Greece, and they were kind of a mini United Nations. They became an opportunity for people from different countries to convene and to discuss issues between them. And in fact, there were even Olympic truces observed, so that when nations were at war, they would simply stop fighting because now it's time for the Olympic Games. Gosh, we might be able to learn something from that. In drama, we have the wonderful plays which were produced in fairly substantial quantity, and which all, particularly citizens of Athens, would regularly attend. Those of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, the three tragedians, as well as the comic plays, especially those of Aristophanes. We still perform them. What wonderful stories they are. What truths they represent. They were really enlightened artists intellectually. Let us not forget literature, the Iliad, the Odyssey. There was lyric poetry from Greece, and all of this expressed in a wonderful language, a language of nuance and sophistication. Some of us who have studied both Greek and Latin would tell you that Greek is a far more sophisticated language. It has a subtlety to it that expresses shades of meaning in a way that Latin never could. So they had a wonderful language. They produced a great literature, and it's literature that we still read today. And I guess my final point about the Greeks and why the Greeks are superior is that they did it from scratch. There really wasn't anybody before them. Sorry to some of those civilizations that think they were pretty important 1000 BC or whatever, but the Greeks really invented much of what I've been talking about here from scratch. What an amazingly productive, creative atmosphere and community they had. Well, that's a pretty positive set of comments about the Greeks. Let's get into those who would say no, the Greeks weren't better. In other words, those who would speak for the Romans instead. Well, the Romans themselves were certainly not unaccomplished. They, like the Greeks, left us with some wonderful literature. Certainly the epic poem, the Aeneid by Virgil, is a wonderful piece of art. We have Roman historians, we have Roman poets, Horace, Ovid. We have the wonderful writings of Cicero, his essays, his great orations. So we have a fantastic collection of literature to draw upon, and not the least of which are the Gallic commentaries of Julius Caesar. Anyone who's studied Latin in school probably started with Caesar, the reason being that his language was so clear, so straightforward and simple that you could understand it quite quickly, which I must say is something that many authors of our era could well take advice from. So there you have wonderful literature. They of course taught us a lot about the military sciences, the techniques that were developed by Pompey and Caesar, and then of course many of the generals who existed during the empire under the emperors Trajan and Hadrian and so forth. We use many of their principles and techniques to this day. I've mentioned the language when I spoke about the writings of Julius Caesar, but more about the language. It was a very clear, well-designed, consistent language. Once you learn it, you can read works in Latin with relative ease. It's a language that speaks with clarity, with a lack of ambiguity. You know where you stand with Latin, and perhaps for that reason it was the wellspring of many other languages. All the Romance languages of Europe, Italian, Romanian, Spanish, Portuguese, and so forth, all spring from the Latin of the Romans. And in fact, the language that we're speaking in now gained a great deal from the Latin of the Romans. When the Norman French came to Britain and caused their language to be merged with Anglo-Saxon, much of what we now have in English, which has Latin bases, came from that event. So a great linguistic accomplishment, perhaps not with the subtlety and nuance of Greek, but on a more practical basis, a model of clarity and straightforward exposition. As an interesting almost aside, we get the Julian calendar from the Romans. Julian, of course, refers, guess who, to Julius Caesar. And of course, his successor, the Emperor Augustus, gave us August. And it was the Romans who figured out the months of the year and the way the whole system should work. And we still have it. So it was well designed. Well, there were fantastic engineers and road builders. They were builders of buildings of the sort that hadn't existed before, because they brought new techniques, new materials to building. They invented the idea of concrete, a mixture of cement and gravel, and were able to build stronger buildings because of that. They invented a particular kind of arch which gave more rigidity to a building, thus enabling the building of substantial edifices of multi-stories. And of course, we all know about their amazing aqueducts, bringing water from great distances. And you can see a lot of those aqueducts. They're still there in a lot of places in Europe, especially in Italy and in Sicily and so forth. So they were great contributors not only to the kind of the network of commerce and travel in ancient Rome, but they invented a approaches which we still have with us today. Next, they gave us Christianity. Of course, the early days of the Christians under some of the more barbarous emperors was fraught, and they were tortured and thrown to the lions, and they had to hide and so forth. But Christianity eventually emerged in Rome, and then eventually became the language of and religion of the empire. And of course, Christianity itself has had an enormous impact on the preservation and creation of knowledge, of art, and so forth through the Middle Ages, especially. And little of that probably would have happened without the Romans. So I guess that's a pretty impressive case that you can make for the Romans. Well, okay, that's the Greeks, that's the Romans. What do I think about it? What's my take? Well, first of all, I have to say that as you've seen from what I've said thus far in this video, their accomplishments, both of them, were astounding. We are still benefiting from them. We must always remember that all knowledge, science particularly, but all of human activity that depends upon knowledge and learning and so forth, builds on what's gone before it. We wouldn't have a lot of what we have now if it hadn't been for the Greeks and the Romans. And similarly, the Romans wouldn't have had much of what they had if it hadn't been for the Greeks, because the Greeks really were the first people who had a blazing outbreak of accomplishment, intellectual and artistic, and the Romans quite sensibly built on that. The Romans weren't the first, but they certainly took what the Greeks gave them and improved greatly on that. But because the Greeks are the first, I'm afraid I have to give them my nod. So for me, it's the Greeks, but the Romans were great too. Okay, well, that's that. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, give me a like, subscribe, give me comments, notifications, etc. And I'll see you at the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.